traditional versus simplified. There's only one sort of original lot of Chinese characters, and they are called traditional characters. Because there are so many Chinese characters, you know, some dictionaries have 600,000, some have even more. There are so many to learn. During the time in China when Mao Zedong was the ruler, he noticed that there was very high illiteracy rates among a lot of the people, and he wanted to empower the people with the ability to read and write. So he thought the first step might be to simplify some of the traditional Chinese characters to make them easier to remember. If characters had less strokes and were more simple, they'd be easier to remember, easier to write, and it would reduce illiteracy rates, so more people would be able to read and write. So it was done quite systematically. Certain radicals, certain parts of characters were simplified in bulk, and then those characters became the new standard way to read and write Chinese. In places like Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong, they didn't adopt these new simplified characters. So that's why often in a lot of overseas press, in overseas Chinese newspapers, you'll see the traditional characters. When I was at university learning characters, I had to learn to read and write the simplified characters. And I also had to learn to recognize the traditional characters in case I was in a place like Taiwan or Singapore where I needed to know the characters. So a lot of the characters haven't been simplified. There's just a certain number of them that have been simplified. So the simplified characters are only new. They've only been around sort of the second half of the 20th century. The simplified characters did improve literacy rates. So on the whole, was a good result. Obviously, learning the simplified characters is a bit easier because they're simpler. They have less strokes than the traditional characters, but there are still a lot of characters that have not been simplified. Also, did you know that if you pick up a Korean newspaper, you'll see some Chinese characters? So Korean people used to use Chinese characters in their writing, and they still do occasionally, but most of all, they have a brand new lot of writing, which they invented themselves only at the end of last century. They have a brand new writing system, and the Japanese have 3 kinds of script, one of them of which is Chinese characters. So Chinese characters are used in a lot of places. So if you are just a beginner and you're starting to learn Chinese characters for the first time, I definitely recommend focusing on the Chinese simplified characters, and then learn to recognize the traditional ones. So when you learn a simplified character, have a look at what the traditional character looked like so you can still recognize it if you find it in a text which is in traditional character. If you find yourself in Singapore or Taiwan or Hong Kong where they use traditional characters, you won't be completely lost. Thanks for watching this episode of Studio China Chats. I'd love you to come over to my website, which is studiochina.com.au, and sign up to get email updates from me. I'd also love you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and come and find me on Instagram. My username on Instagram is @StudioChina. And I'll see you next week for another episode of Studio China Chats.